Welcome everyone to this series of webinars on the new frontiers of human rights. My name is Endy Moraes. I'm the director of Fordham Law School, Institute on Religion, Law, and Lawyers' Work, and I'm honored to be moderating this event today. I also want to thank our co-sponsors, the Center for Research in Politics and Human Rights in Italy, and Observatorio de Derechos Humanos from Spain. On October 19, we hosted the first of these meetings focusing on the birth and development of the human rights discourse. Today, instead, we will be concentrating on the topic of transhumanism. If in our first meeting, we discussed how the Universal Declaration of Human Rights has been created and developed through the years, today we will focus more on the challenges new technologies are imposing in the human rights framework. This structure has received many criticisms through the years for how it has been politically instrumentalized and applied with bias, using double standards by states and civil society organizations. But despite the relevance of these criticisms, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights represents, without a doubt, an outstanding achievement. It provides us with the primary common language of most individuals and organizations worldwide who fight for human dignity. There is certainly a need to acknowledge that the human rights framework are deeply embedded in a discourse that privileges the human in human rights. However, concepts of what constitutes this human has been eroded through the development of various emerging technologies, including artificial intelligence, and transhumanism, both of which support the emergence of new kinds of humans, enhanced humans. We face then a growing tension between the values underpinning the original declaration and the new challenges produced by technological change. So in our meeting today, we want to address this very complex theme, and I will provide you right now just with a very brief introduction to it that aims at defining the boundaries also of our conversation today. And each of the issues that I will mention could become an event in itself. Maybe it will be a future event, so stay tuned. Let me start by saying that, first of all, one could argue that if there is a right missing in the declaration, is the right to create new rights. However, if we follow the human rights journey at the United Nations, we find a continuous increase of new rights, expanding the focus from individuals to specific groups, new actors, new issues. This development reflects social changes and new demands, many of them inspired by the values that guided the declaration. But as a result of these changes, we can mention, for example, the Human Rights Declaration, the Women's Rights Declaration of Beijing in 1995, the Convention of the Rights of the Child in 1989, the rights of indigenous people in 2007, while on the scientific and technological front, the Universal Declaration of Human Genome and Human Rights, adopted by UNESCO in 1997 and endorsed by the General Assembly in 1998, defining guidelines for scientific research and its applications. More recently, the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights has published several reports on the impact of new information and communication technologies, the latest in September 2021, very recent, on the right to privacy in the digital age. These new rights demonstrate how the human rights framework has evolved through the years, the potential conflict between them, depending obviously on the inherent value system that the person is accessing them. As we think about the impact of new technologies, then these introductions, I identified 4 groups of issues. And here that is what I say, that each one of these groups of issues could become in itself an event in itself, an independent event. So, but that is really just to give us with the larger picture. So the first group, not included in the original architecture of the declaration, are challenges to the survival of humans as a species. We can say that there are no human rights without human beings, as noted before, right? Human rights have evolved from a focus on individuals to specific groups and increasingly on humanity as a whole. In fact, the dangers to the survival of humanity in the form of the atomic bomb were already present during the drafting of the declaration, but it was not mentioned specifically, addressed in this way specifically. Awareness of the dangers to the continuity of humanity, whether physically as a species or as individuals, as free, autonomous entities, is growing, including increasing concern over climate change, pandemics, weapons of mass destruction. Their potential catastrophic consequences confront humanity with the need to reshape the modern view centered solely on humans to include also the environment, nature, and these represent a different set of challenges than rights abuses associated with individuals or groups, and require the cooperation of all states to address them. They all demand international cooperation that could be guided by what Hans Jonas identifies as the principle of responsibility, in which the moral measure of societal acts should be their immediate impact as much as their effect on future generations, just to give an example. So that is the first group of issues, the risk to humanity as a species. The second group of issues is related to transformations in the functioning of society or the human condition. So the basic principles of human rights lose the social foundation at times. The systemic use of artificial intelligence to control social life, producing a society of surveillance, decisions outsourced to algorithms, and the growing potential for modification of the human genome and cybernetic implants are disintegrating the conditions under which the idea of freedom, privacy, autonomy are based. Here we could even talk about hacking not only machines and systems, but also humans. A situation in which the state and corporations can control individuals through centralized systems of information and coordination of social activities, and potentially through the implantation of electronic devices and genomic intervention. We face a growing tension between values underpinning the original declaration and the new challenges produced by technological change. A third group of issues related to the original declaration of political freedom and the respect for human dignity, which includes classical individual and collective rights, but which, as mentioned, need to be resized, revisited, considering the impact of the widespread use of artificial intelligence and possible uses of genetic engineering. Finally, the fourth group represents socioeconomic demands. It includes the accumulated social problems such as hunger, poverty, access to primary health care, but also emerging issues associated with the impact of new forms of autonomous jobs and the impact of automation on the labor market, which are crumbling labor rights and the trade union organizations that were their leading promoters. So that is really the big picture and the set of issues that could be addressed. Today, we'll focus on a very specific piece of it, which is transhumanism. And so having had this big picture, let me introduce our speakers. Dr. Juan Garcia Gutierrez is an associate professor at the National Distance Education University in Spain. His main areas are philosophy and education theory, particularly its political and social aspects and technological innovations, philosophical and ethical implications. Dr. Gutierrez will address the new technologies and transhumanism. Then we will hear from Dr. Maria Rosaria Piccinni, that will present to us on transhumanism between self-determination and respect of human dignity, ethical and legal limits. She has a master's in human rights and information technology and works for the Municipality of Taranto in Italy. On one last note, before we move on, I want to apologize to our audience and also to our first speaker, Dr. Gutierrez, because our simultaneous translation is not working. So we will proceed with Dr. Gutierrez's presentation, but read by Dr. Chiara Berneri, excuse me. Dr. Berneri and Gutierrez, thank you so much for your flexibility with us, and we deal with as we deal with this challenge together and try to solve it. Dr. Gutierrez will be available for questions, and if you do have questions for him, please drop it in the chat and we will address it later. And so at this point, I will pass on to Dr. Berneri the floor, please. Thank you.
Thank you for the invitation to participate in this series of seminars on the frontiers of human rights. Undoubtedly, the theme of these seminars on the frontiers of human rights makes even more sense if we think about the frontiers of human rights in relation to technologies. This is something that has been highlighted in different international documents, such as the report prepared by the June 2019 Human Rights Council Advisory Committee on the New and Emerging Technologies and Human Rights, or the European Parliament resolution, which for the first time opened the door to political reflection on the social impacts of artificial intelligence. This session will address a current and even futuristic theme, because it has always been in the spotlight of literature and Hollywood movies. It is about reflecting on the relationship between people and machines. Machines that are becoming more and more sophisticated, efficient, and above all, autonomous. In today's session, we will briefly present some reflections on the anthropological impact of emerging technologies. In other words, anthropological models generate some visions of technological development. We will also see briefly the result of the international community's concern with these technological developments through the recent approval of the UNESCO recommendation on the ethics of artificial intelligence. Another implicit objective of today's session is to provide students of the legal sector with a broad overview of the fields and developments that are opening up in the world of law in the face of the progressive advance of digital technologies. Now, let's talk about two important things. One, the various anthropological models that emerge from the development of emerging technologies. And second, we will present some international initiatives that, although without specific legal weight, try to regulate the impact and relationships that digital technologies have on people's lives. Specifically, we will briefly present some international initiatives, such as the recently approved UNESCO recommendation on the ethics of artificial intelligence, which I previously mentioned. We speak of new and emerging technologies to refer more specifically to technological innovations that transform the boundaries between virtual, physical, and biological spaces, or of converging technologies, such as information and communication technologies, biotechnologies, nanotechnologies, and cognitive sciences. It is precisely these converging and emerging technologies that blur the boundaries between virtual, physical, and biological spaces that constitute a new frontier for human rights. The hypothesis we propose is simple. We cannot advance and develop technologies that impact the identity and even the very biological configuration of human beings without reflecting ethically on the impacts they have for the human being, for humanity, and for the environment. In other words, we cannot lose sight of the subject, including its corporeality, of technologies that and of what constitutes its dignity and fullness. If we lose sight of this ethical horizon, we run the risk of diluting the notion of the human nature. And we did with losing sight of the idea of the dignity of the person that constitutes the cornerstone, the foundation of the whole system of human rights. Therefore, emerging technologies foster a particular understanding of the human being, thus projecting an anthropological image and a particular axiological framework that refutes the idea of the neutrality of technology. As we know, we have technologies that influence us from the outside, understanding as such our entire relational and decision-making complex, influencing and conditioning our way of accessing information, how we relate and how we conduct ourselves in the world, our preferences and our convictions. We can say that now we can not only live from the internet, but we can also live on the internet. We have experiences of the power of cyberactivism and how Twitter and Facebook contributed to the development of the Arab Spring. And we also know some harmful impacts for democracies, such as the case of Cambridge Analytica. Or even think about the recent case of the Facebook papers, which in its initial internal documents knew that Instagram was toxic for the mental health of young girls. Other technologies intervene from the inside instead of the human being in a more direct and invasive way in our corporeality, whether mental or cerebral, or in any other part or member of the body, including intervention in genetic selection and modification. All this generates an understanding of the human being, an anthropological image, and the promotion of some values and principles to the detriment of others. The thesis they defend and the areas of intervention they propose allow us to distinguish three major positions or currents: the neurodeterminism current, transhumanism current, and finally, not so much a current as critique of the previous ones, the bioconservative line. So let's start from neurodeterminism. We can say that the mind-brain problem is one of the oldest issues in philosophical research, something that is expected to be solved with the research project currently underway. The possibilities opened up by brain research have generated neuro-optimism, characterized not so much by the scope of the knowledge produced as by the promise of its purposes, since this current aspires to understand how the brain makes the mind conscious. Neurodeterminism is a current that tries to reduce morality to a biological explanation. It is important to investigate the biology of moral reasoning. However, the aim of this position is not only to explain, but also to limit and reduce the whole explanation of the concept of the complex moral behavior of people to purely biological and physiological reasons. At the same time, this research runs parallel to pharmacological research capable of developing psychopharmaceuticals to help regulate mental processes, both from a therapeutical point of view, as in the case of neurodegenerative diseases, etc., and to extend and improve them, as the transhumanist current will postulate. This current argues that neurosciences will eventually unveil the mysteries of the brain, and thus all mental states and processes, since all these activities are summarized in a product of chemical interactions and neurological connections. If this is so, we will also be able to identify the drugs needed to control them and reproduce the right conditions for them to develop outside the brain. Something that allows us to open the door to describe the transhumanist current. So let's move on to transhumanism now. Unlike cognitive sciences or neurosciences that have a scientific anchor and, for the most part, assume a framework of ethical principles for their development, transhumanism itself constitutes an alternative ideological framework for the experimentation and development of converging technologies. In the 2015 UNESCO report, the 2015 UNESCO report entitled Rethinking Education Towards a Global Common Good. And it stated the following: in the late 20th and early 21st centuries, critiques of both anthropocentric and theocentric humanisms have emerged for postmodernists, some feminists, and more recently, those who consider themselves transhumanists or even posthumanists, who advocate biological selection and radical enhancement. The first thing we can say is that transhumanism itself constitutes an alternative ideological framework that orients and gives meaning to converging technologies beyond bioethical or neuroethical approaches. Transhumanism affirms the responsibility to technologically improve the human being with all available technologies, and not only individually, but humanity as a whole, through genetic manipulation, for example. From this perspective, transhumanism would be an intermediate evolutionary moment until reaching the post-human, a being already an hybrid between the biological and the technological. In this current, the human being is something obsolete that must be overcome. For this current, the human being is no longer the measure of progress or development, and therefore does not have to limit us, nor does it constitute a normative source or an ethical reference. Transhumanism gets rid of this anthropological dependence and declares an autonomous scientific intentionality that configures another ethics and predominance of other values. Progress resolved as a value independent of the human being, and that is solved only technically and does not attend to ethical or moral questions. Among others, the pillars of transhumanism would be the pursuit of superintelligence, super longevity, and super well-being. Thus, physical and personality enhancement, including overcoming involuntary suffering and giving individuals a wide personal choice as to how they can make their lives possible. This involves the use of techniques to aid memory, concentration, and mental energy, life extension therapies, reproductive choice technologies, cryonics procedures, and many other possible human enhancement and modification technologies. For this reason, it is necessary to distinguish NBIC research from the intentionality with which the transhumanist current appropriates it, as if development of research to improve the human being were not possible without assuming the transhumanist thesis. In fact, the debate on the type of ethically admissible enhancements is the one claimed by the so-called bioconservatives. In this context, the European Union identifies three dimensions to human enhancement: the enhancement of one or more bodily and cognitive functions of an individual, the enhancement of the species in a purely biological sense, but including the use of human-machine interface, and thirdly, the enhancement of humanity in a holistic sense. For the time being, in the European context, only only this has been, I'm really sorry. I'm really sorry. I've lost a piece of the reading, but I will find it. Bear with me 1 second. Just 1 second. Sorry for the interruption. I will be with you in a second. I'm really sorry. I'm back with you. There was a technical issue, but I found the full text. Okay, so. Okay, sorry about this. So we were moving on from transhumanism to bioconservatism. So I'm gonna start from that again. So for this reason, it is necessary to distinguish NBIC research from the intentionality with which the transhumanist current appropriates it, as if development or research to improve the human being were not possible without assuming the transhumanist thesis. In fact, the debate on the type of ethically admissible enhancements is one claimed by the so-called bioconservatives. In this context, the European Union identifies three dimensions to human enhancement: the enhancement of one or more bodily and cognitive function of an individual, the enhancement of the species in a purely biological sense, but including the use of human-machine interface, and thirdly, the enhancement of humanity in an holistic sense. For the time being, in the For the time being, in the European context, only this first type of human enhancement is ethically admissible, thus distancing itself from transhumanist ideas. Before going on to expose the bioconservationist criticism, we can say that these technologies of human enhancement are incapable of explaining the moral horizon contained in the very notion of human enhancement. In short, transhumanism focuses on a notion of quantitative improvement in the more, but proves incapable of speaking of improvement in ethical and moral terms. For example, in consists of being better. What consists being better? Bioconservationist approach. This approach or current stands out for linking ethical responsibility and technological development. And in general, the authors of this current share a warning against the dangers of technological development without ethical references. This line is defended by authors such as Fukuyama, Habermas, or Sandal, focused on maintaining an idea of human nature in the face of emerging technologies, which risk blurring the human condition and its basic moral attributes. For them, the good cannot be defined in quantitative terms, nor in terms of manipulation of life, nor using technologies to modify human nature. And all this undermines our dignity. One of the most representative titles of this current, and which condenses the criticism of transhumanist position, is Sandal's book, Against Perfection. In his book, he assumes the thesis that human life is a gift beyond our desire for domination and a Promethean aspiration to remake nature to satisfy our desires. For him, assuming that life is a gift fosters three virtues: humility, responsibility, and solidarity. Virtues that we consider important to assuming technological development, since the technologies currently available have led to a reduction of the vital horizon of the human relationship with the world, through the illusion that everything that exists can only have meaning if it is subject to disposal or transformation. That is, only to the extent that it can be produced, used, or transformed technically. That is why these virtues are fundamental in the hyper-technological world: humility, responsibility, and solidarity. Now we move on to look at the second part of the presentation, which is about the ethical proposals for an international regulation of technologies. So next we are going to look at the UNESCO recommendation on the ethics of artificial intelligence. After this, and in conclusion, I would like to briefly mention two other international references to safeguard ethical research and development of technologies. The UNESCO recommendation on the ethics of artificial intelligence is a resolution adopted by the UNESCO General Assembly at its last General Conference. Its importance lies in the fact that it is the first global standard on the ethics of artificial intelligence adopted by the member states of UNESCO. Therefore, a standard of universal character. We cannot forget that UNESCO is formed by 193 member states, which have adopted it. This document establishes a series of common values and principles, universally accepted, that will guide the construction of national and international legal measures, and to ensure an adequate and humane development of artificial intelligence. Furthermore, because of this humanistic character, I believe another important aspect of this resolution is that the values and the principles that are affirmed can be extrapolated in general to the development and use of digital technologies. The recommendation provides an open definition of artificial intelligence, as it considered artificial intelligence systems to be systems capable of processing data and information in a way that resembles intelligent behavior and generally encompasses aspects of reasoning, learning, perception, prediction, planning, or control. Ethical issues related to artificial intelligence systems, therefore, cover all stages of the life cycle of these systems. The resolution understands them to range from research, design, and development through maintenance, operation, commercialization, financing, monitoring and evaluation, validation, end of use, and the commissioning to use. The recommendation notes that values and principles should be respected by all the actors during the life cycle of artificial intelligence systems, and that these values play an important role as ideals that motivate the orientation of policy measures and legal norms. Next, we're going to see which are those values and principles that are part of this universal ethical proposal. The values included in this recommendation are as follows: respect, protection, and promotion of human rights, fundamental freedoms, and human dignity. The resolution states the inviolable and inherent dignity of every human being. That is the basis of the universal, indivisible, unalienable, interdependent, and interrelated system of human rights and fundamental freedoms. Therefore, no human being or human community should suffer harm or subjugation of any kind, whether physical, economic, social, political, cultural, mental, at any stage of the life cycle of artificial intelligence systems. Prosperity of the environment and ecosystem, point number 2. The environment and the ecosystem are an existential necessity for humanity and other living beings to enjoy the benefits derived from artificial intelligence advances. 3, ensure diversity and inclusion. The diversity of lifestyle, choices, beliefs, options, expressions, personal experiences, including optional use of artificial intelligence systems, and the co-design of these architectures should not be restricted during any stage of the life cycle of such systems. Point 4, living in peaceful, just, and interconnected societies. The notion of interconnectedness of human beings is based on the knowledge that each of them belongs to a larger whole, which thrives when all its constituents parts can progress. Therefore, throughout the life cycle of artificial intelligence systems, they must not segregate or objectify human beings and communities, nor undermine their freedom, decision-making, autonomy, and security, nor divide or pick individuals and groups against each other, nor threaten the coexistence of human beings, other living beings, and the natural environment. On the other hand, the principles proclaimed in the resolution are as follows: proportionality and harmlessness. We must recognize that artificial intelligent technologies do not in themselves guarantee the prosperity of human beings or the environment and ecosystems. Furthermore, in the event that any harm to the humans, human rights and fundamental freedoms may occur, risk assessment procedures and measures to prevent such harm from occurring should be ensured. Furthermore, and this is a very, very important point, in cases where decisions are understood to have any irreversible or difficult to reverse impact or may involve life and death decisions, the final decision should be made by a human being. Artificial intelligence systems should not be used for social rating or mass surveillance purposes. This is especially important because of what it means for the military and collective security domains. 2, safety and security. Unintended damage and vulnerabilities to attacks should be avoided. Artificial intelligence, safety, and security will be developed through data access frameworks that are sustainable, that respect privacy and encourage better training and validation of artificial intelligence modes and use quality data. 3, equity and non-discrimination. This involves adopting an inclusive approach to ensure that the benefits of artificial intelligence are available and accessible, taking into account the needs of different age groups, cultural systems, linguistic groups, people with disability, etc. It also notes that states should strive to reduce digital divides and ensure inclusive access to artificial intelligence development. Sustainability. 4, the proposal is that artificial intelligence developments can benefit sustainability objectives. 5, right to privacy and data protection. Here it is stated that privacy constitutes an essential right for the protection of the dignity, autonomy, and capacity to act of the human being. This includes algorithm systems that must be subject to privacy impact assessments from their conception state. Supervision and human decisions. In this aspect, not only individual artificial intelligence supervision is important, but also public supervision, which implies the following principle. Transparency and explainability. 7, that is, artificial intelligence systems must be transparent, including those that have an extraterritorial effect. People must be fully informed when decisions are based on algorithms. Thus, explainability is another important principle in the ethical framework of artificial intelligence. It implies that citizens should be able to know and know how these systems work, and that the algorithms imply, and what the algorithms imply when they affect them. Explainability involves making the results of artificial intelligence systems intelligible and providing information about them. 8, responsibility and accountability. In this regard, appropriate monitoring, impact assessment, audit, and due diligence mechanisms should be developed, including whistleblower protection. 9, awareness raising and education. It is clear that many of these principles cannot be developed without appropriate educational and pedagogical measures. Therefore, there is a need for further training of citizens on the issues of technologies, artificial intelligence, digital competencies, and on the specific value of artificial intelligence ethics. 10, adaptive multi-stakeholder governance and collaboration. This principle opens the door to the international legal development of measures that can regulate the development of these artificial intelligence technologies in accordance with declarations and other human rights standards. Specifically, it states that measures should be taken to take into account changes in technologies and the emergence of new stakeholder groups to enable meaningful participation of individuals, marginalized communities and groups, and where appropriate, indigenous people. Finally, together with the values and principles, a series of action areas are established in relation to 11 areas: ethical impact assessment, ethical governance and management, data policy, international development and cooperation, the environment and ecosystems, gender, culture, education and research, communication and information, economy and labor, health and wellness. To conclude, and Although it is possible to find more organizations concerned with ethics in relation to technologies, we will mention two organizations that promote this ethical reflection in relation to the promotion of human rights and technologies, or international ethical commitment in technological development. These are the work of the private Neuro Right Foundation and the work of STOA, Scientific and Technological Options Assessment, within the framework of the European Union. Therefore, a public entity which, with its reports and studies, has been responsible for advising the European Parliament on technologies since 1987, when a first pilot program was launched. In conclusion, we would just like to remind you of the idea that we have tried to convey with this work, which is no less important because it is simple and well known. Technological progress, any technological progress, does not now take us away from the personal and collective effort to conquer freedom and human fulfillment. Technological progress must be accompanied by an ethical progress that guides it and gives it a humanizing sense. In other words, the yearning for happiness, the meaning inscribed in human nature, cannot be satisfied by the technological means and devices at our disposal, no matter how sophisticated and disruptive they may be. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Chiara, and also for enduring
for the
all our technical problems.
Sorry.
Thank you. And thank you, Dr. Gutierrez, for this amazing presentation. And without further ado, I will pass on the word to Dr. Piccinni, please.
Thank you very much. Good morning to everyone. I'll start my presentation, and I try to focus on the relationship between self-determination, so freedom of science research, of course, but also freedom of individual to decide how to act for his own bodies, and the respect of human dignity that represents one of the most important limit not only legal but also ethical. So I'll start by a brief definition of transhumanism. It is a philosophical and intellectual movement which advocates for the enhancement of the human condition by developing and making widely available sophisticated technologies able to increase human sensory reception, emotive ability, or cognitive capacity, as well as radically improve human health and extend human lifespans. But what is human nature for transhumanists? Because transhumanism is a philosophy, it's a very real way of intend human being and his relationship with nature. Transhumanists view human nature as a work in progress, a half-baked beginning that we can learn to remold in desirable ways. Current humanity need not to be the end point of evolution. Transhumanists hope that by responsible use of science, technology, and other rational means, we shall eventually manage to become post-human, beings with vastly greater capacities than present human beings have. There are, for transhumanists, transhumanism project, there are three basic conditions to realize their project of enhancement of human being. The first one is technological progress, of course, but then there are two other conditions: wide access and individual freedom and individual choice of self-determination. Let's see them one by one. Technological progress is a hope that has been fueled since the 80s of the last century by a series of technological innovation that dreamed of a new and better world. The development of nanotechnologies to radically rebuild our bodies with help of nanorobots, which would repair DNA errors or fight pathogens, or research on cryogenics as a means of curbing biological degradation. Then progress in psychodrugs and medication to improve muscle tone of selectively erase some memories, together with prenatal or pre-implant genetic analysis and other types of therapies that could be used to improve quality of life or to cure disease, represent for transhumanists a set of arguments that nourish their utopia. The goal is not only to alleviate pain or deficiencies, but to implement in the most intimate structure of the nervous system their abilities, human abilities, and the powers inherent in the human condition. Then, another important condition to realize transhumanist project is wide access. What do they intend for wide access? Wide access is the full realization of the care transhumanist values. It requires that ideally everybody should have the opportunity to become post-human. There are many reasons for supporting wide access: to help gain support for transhumanist project, to increase the chances that you will get the opportunity to become post-human, and to increase the chances that those you care about can become post-human, to alleviate human suffering on as wide a scale as possible. Another important condition is individual freedom and individual choice, that is to say, self-determination, because transhumanists invoke self-determination freedom that they intend as negative freedom. Negative freedom is the absence of obstacles to action, mainly legal obstacles. To be free in this sense means to me that others do not interfere in my activity. Above all, the states. So the legal limit is to action, to science action. Transhumanists finds its roots in a deep and ancient mythology, because the idea of improving the human species through the implementation of biotechnologies to form a new involved species far from primitive nature is issued in literature and philosophy. The human desire to acquire new capacities is an ancient of our species itself. We have always sought to expand the boundaries of our existence, be it socially, geographically, or mentally. The first myth important is the Epic of Gilgamesh. In the Sumerian Epic of Gilgamesh, approximately 1700 before Christ, a king sets out on a quest for immortality. Gilgamesh learns that there exists a natural means as herb that grows at the bottom of the sea. He successfully retrieves this plant, but the snake steals it from him before he can eat it. So he doesn't realize this objective to be, this goal to be immortal. Then Prometheus and Icarus myth, the quest to transcend our natural confines, has long been viewed with ambivalence, however, reigning it in his concept of hubris, that some ambitions are off limits and will backfire if pursued. The ancient Greeks exhibited the ambivalence in their mythology. Prometheus stole fire from Zeus and gave it to humans, thereby permanently improving the human condition. Yet for this act, he was severely punished by Zeus. The gods are repeatedly challenged, quite successfully, by Daedalus, the clever engineer and artist who uses no magical means to extend human capabilities. In the end, disaster happened when his son Icarus ignores paternal warnings and flies too close to the sun, causing the wax in his wings to melt. Then the Golem story in Judaism mysticism. Golem is an animated being crafted from inanimate material. In the early Golem stories, a golem could be created by a holy person who was able to share some of God's wisdom and power. Although the golem, not being able to speak, was never more than a shadow of God's creations. In the later story, which were influenced by the more Islamic concern about humanity's getting too close to God, the golem becomes a creation of overreaching mystics who were inevitably punished for their blasphemy. The story of the Sorceress Apprentice is a variation of this theme. The apprentice animates a broomstick to fetch water, but is unable to make the broom stop. Like Frankenstein, it is a story of technology out of control. And then this is the core of this presentation. What is human dignity, and what is the relationship with human enhancement? At the basis of transhumanism, there is a denial of human nature limits and the supremacy of individual free will. But here arises the first juridical question: how can be intended freedom, and where do transhumanists take their idea of freedom? The first legal principle involved in the proposal of transhumanism is human dignity. Transhumanists propose a new concept of dignity, where human ability enhancement do not put in danger the principle of dignity, but on the contrary, strengthen it. But human dignity has been lately embodied in European law and in the Charter of Fundamental Rights of the European Union, and occupies a very symbolic and central position. Indeed, the first article of the Charter states that human dignity is inviolable. It must be respected and protected. Principle of human dignity is placed even before the right of life, is a precondition of every human right. While Article 3, entitled Right to Integrity of the Person, refers to the right to the integrity and to the prohibition of eugenic practice and cloning. I'd like to read this Article 3 because it's particularly important, especially in the relationship between science and respect of human limits and human nature. Article 3 of European Charter, its right to integrity of the person, and says that everyone has the right to respect for his or her physical and mental integrity. In the fields of medicine and biology, the following must be respected, in particular, the free and informed consent of the person concerned, according to the procedure laid down by law. The prohibition of eugenic practice, in particular those aiming at the selection of persons, the prohibition on making the human body and its part as such as a source of financial gain, and the prohibition of reproductive cloning of human beings. But what is human dignity? So it's not easy to give a very definition of human beings without finding its root in an ethical, moral, and religious ground. At its most basic, the concept of human dignity is the belief that all people hold a special value that is tied solely to their humanity. It has nothing to do with their class, race, gender, religion, abilities, or any other factor other than them being human. The original meaning of the word dignity established that someone deserved respect because of their human status. In the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, that concept was turned on its head. Article 1 states, all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. Simply by being human, all people deserve respect. Human rights naturally spring from that dignity. Human dignity also has a religious framework because human dignity is not limited to human rights. In fact, for centuries, religions around the world have recognized the form of human dignity as we now understand it. Most religions teach that humans are essentially equal for one reason or another. In Christianity, Islam, and Judaism, it's because humans were created in the image of God. Dignity is something that a divine being gives to people. In Catholic social teaching, the phrase human dignity is used specifically to support the Church's belief that every human life is sacred. So the main question is, principle of human dignity, which has been defined in terms of protecting human beings against all forms of oppressive conduct, could be extended to prohibiting an individual from acts that manipulate its own body. In other terms, why recognize human dignity is so important in finding the limits of transhumanism. All human rights derive from the dignity and worth inherent in the human person. And the human person is the central subject of human rights and fundamental freedoms, and consequently should be the principal beneficiary and should participate actively in the realization of those rights and freedoms. In this new biotechnological and digital era, the humanist paradigm, which considers the individual as an end in itself and defends the sacred charter of the human condition and the dignity of people as moral subjects whose liberty is inviolable and inalienable, is being gradually replaced by a transhumanist paradigm, which, in its most utilitarian version, proposes overcoming our natural limits by artificial means in search of the organic and intellectual perfection on the human species. The questions has been faced by European Court in the case of Brussels versus Greenpeace. The general feeling that the principle of human dignity constitutes a primary obstacle to the realization of transhumanism has been recently confirmed in a case law established by Brussels versus Greenpeace, a decision of the European courts on 2011. The question here was that of determining whether European law permitted the patenting of a process allowing for the production from stem cells extracted from human embryos of an almost unlimited quantity of isolated and purified precursor cells having neural or glial properties. The challenge was to define what the concept of a human embryo means. The European Court used the principle of dignity as a guideline for its decision and concluded on a very broad definition of the human embryo. Many pro-life organizations have declared this decision a victory as a first step towards a legal recognition of the embryo as a person. As explained by the Advocate General in his opinion, human dignity is a principle which must be applied not only to an existing human person, to a child who has been born, but also to the human body from the first stage in its development, it is from fertilization. That means that from a legal point of view, the embryo is not a person, but is still a part of the human body. Moreover, and this is extremely important in terms of the discussion regarding transhumanism, the judges have extended the application of the principle of dignity from the person to their body. Although it seeks to promote investment in the field of biotechnology, use of biological material originating from human must be consistent with regard for fundamental rights and, in particular, the dignity of the person. And so, in the conclusion, it's important to underline the point of view of Pontifical Academy for Life from the opening addresses by Archbishop Vincenzo Paglia. And the title of this workshop was Roboethics, Humans, Machines, and Earth. Technology that put itself at service of the care for life, refusing to discard it when it does not meet standard of efficiency and well-being decided by a machine, it's a real blessing. When technology takes power with our passive complicity, we ourselves become responsible for the loss of that blessing. We must be lords of technology at the service of life, and not masters of life subject to technology. This is the covenant that we must seal. The complexity of this discernment is certainly real. It requires a period of careful and open listening and critical understandings of the phenomena that surround us. And so, in conclusion, these are the words of Pope Francis. He says that technology holds the potential to benefit all humankind, but it also poses risky and unforeseen results. The rapid evolution of increased technological capacities, for example, with artificial intelligence and robotics, creates a dangerous enchantment. Instead of handing human life the tools that will improve care, there is the risk of handing life over to the logic of instrument. In his speech, the Pope noted that the dramatic paradox at work today, just when humanity has developed the scientific and technological abilities to bring improved well-being more fairly and widely to everyone, instead there is increasing inequality and worsening conflicts. While grateful for research that has solved problems once thought insurmountable, new and more insidious complications and threats have emerged. The problem is when technology is pursued solely for mastering a whole new ability while neglecting technology's true purpose. And for whom is it meant, the Pope Francis said. So it's important to individuate the boundary and the limits of this new technology. Technology should always be at the service of humanity and respectful of every human person's dignity. Increased automation, sophisticated robotics, and artificial intelligence could become socially dangerous if the human person becomes a product of technology instead of technology becoming more human. The Pope encouraged continued dialogue and contribution by people of faith in the search for universally shared values and criteria to help guide technological research and development. Having ethical guidelines can help leaders and those in position of authority to make the right decision and help to protect human rights and the planet. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Piccinni. It was really an enlightening presentation, so rich for many, many aspects. Really, really thank you. And I don't know if our participants have questions, please drop it in the chat. But to start us off, I would like to ask you, Dr. Piccinni, one quick question, really based also on your presentation of what now you present on the dialogues that are going on in order to protect human dignity. And a question is, would it be the case to prevent the development of some technologies altogether? And legally, in a sense, not even legally, I think it's more like politically the correct question, would that even be possible? Now that there are different groups of scientists trying to engage in this type of scientific development in different areas of the world, dealing with these different legislations too. And we know the United Nations provide a framework where these principles and values, as also one presented, are being proposed, developed, discussed. But is there concretely a possibility that together as civil society will be able to pose a limit to these technologies? Should we, where would we draw the line? Just initial question.
Yes, thank you. It's not a simple question because it's not easy to answer, to give an answer. But I think that the main principle is the sustainability. So to find a balancing between freedom of science and respect of human rights. But international community can give a framework for delimiting some standards. But there is a free will of each state to increase its normative framework. So because international rights can also give a generic framework, but the rule of the states is important in this case. But I think that an important role is played by civil society in this, because a scientific community and a civil organization, faith also, because to give a significance to human dignity is not possible without an ethical and moral rules. So we can impose a law, but if this law is not adverted as a personal moral necessity, it's difficult to find a legal imposition to this kind of questions. So I think that the role of civil society is fundamental. Civil societies, religions, and then the possibility of the states to delimit this principle of sustainability. So a balancing between freedom of science and respect of human dignity. So informed consensus on medical treatment, for example, respect of privacy and respect of all standard limits, not use embryo cell for enhanced human. So it's important to use medicine and science to give well-being to people, not to erase or modificate race and to do experiments without the consent of people. This is an important limit, and I hope that states could have a normative framework that can delimitate this use of technology. I'm sorry for my bad English, but I try to explain on my best.
Not at all. No, thank you so much. And I will draw from your answer and ask you, Dr. Gutierrez, you talked about in your presentation about values and principles and the work that the United Nations is now undergoing. So one thing that also Dr. Piccinni presented was how transhumanists try to avoid suffering. And so a question would be if transhumanists are trying to avoid suffering as much as possible, is there a value to human suffering? And if so, how that is being perceived in these international arenas that you are working on?
Posso rispondere in italiano e gli chiedo a Chiara se può fare la traduzione. Grazie. La prima domanda, che sono molto d'accordo con Maria Rosaria, io direi due cose, perché l'esempio che abbiamo fatto con questa dichiarazione della UNESCO è importante per l'universalità che ha questa dichiarazione. E questo è molto importante perché penso che...
Juan,
sì?
give a moment to Chiara.
Shall I? Okay, I give it. So, yeah, basically, it's the reference to the declaration of the UNESCO is very important to draw this answer because of the universality of that declaration.
È importante avere lo stesso marco giuridico per tutta la ricerca e l'uso della tecnologia, perché per esempio, non è lo stesso framework giuridico nell'Europa che nella Cina. Allora questo è molto importante, avere lo stesso framework.
It's important to have the same juridical and legal framework for every country, because obviously what is valid in Europe, for example, is not in China. So it's important to have that universality and common legal framework.
E poi il valore della trasparenza, della valutazione che può fare non soltanto il sistema giuridico, ma anche la società civile.
And the value of transparency that can be done not just by this common legal framework, but also by the civil society.
E poi una parola sulla sofferenza. Giusto per questo abbiamo parlato nell'esposizione del libro di Sandal, Contro la perfezione.
One word on pain and suffering. In my presentation, I refer to the book of Sandal, Contro la perfezione, so against perfection.
Alla fine penso che quello che define la natura umana è giustamente la sofferenza, la limitazione, tutto quello che non è perfetto. L'uomo non è perfetto, ma la salvazione non è nella perfezione. La salvezza non è che noi arriviamo a una perfezione, perché il transumanesimo e tutti quanti che pensano lo morale dalla prospettiva della tecnologia hanno una prospettiva molto di quantità, non di qualità. Non so se mi cerco di spiegare.
That's so basically it's like the problem of life. It's not perfection. So from the point of view of the transhumanists, their problem seems to be more about quantity, but not quality. Whereas if we think about life, life has pain, limitations, and so that is part of life, but salvation doesn't come from perfection.
E questo è molto importante perché la salvezza, la nostra perfezione non è nello sviluppo tecnologico.
Our salvation, our perfection is not in the technological development.
C'è un versetto di Hölderlin che dice, mi sembra, lì dove cresce il pericolo, c'è anche la salvezza.
So there's a little extract of Hölderlin that says, where there is danger, there is where salvation rises.
Questo vuol dire che non dobbiamo buttare fuori la tecnologia. La tecnologia è molto importante per il nostro sviluppo e anche per lo sviluppo del futuro, ma un sviluppo a misura dell'uomo, non l'uomo a misura della macchina.
So we don't have to throw away technology. Technology is very important for the development of human beings, but technology for human being and not human beings for technology.
Grazie. Grazie, Chiara.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, both of you. And at this point, I would just ask to each of you to just give us what gives you hope also within this topic, and a final word maybe that you have in your minds and your hearts that you want to share with us. Who'd like to go first?
Maria Rosaria.
I just want to say that my final hope is that technology could increase by it's a tool in the hand of man, and not that technology is at the first sight. And so the desire of man to become God, I don't think it's a good thing. So as mythology teaches us, also in centuries before, there is also this desire of man to possess something that can possess, so the perfection, the immortality, something that I don't think that is a good thing, because if nature has its own limits, it's important that these limits are respected, because going beyond could be very, very dangerous. And so it could cause much inequality between people, because still now digital divide is a great problem between the poor part of the world and richest countries. So we are seeing this, for example, for the COVID vaccine. So there are industrialized countries in which we are doing a vaccine, the first, the second, the third, and other parts of the world in which there are no vaccinated people. And so this is just one of the example of the use of medicine could be spread all over the world. So instead of doing much more to realize, to reach perfection. It's important to share medicine, scientific discovery for the well-being of all human people, not only for a little part of human, and so to increase inequality. And this is just my opinion. And I'm sorry again for my bad English.
No, I'll be sorry at all. Thank you so much, Dr. Piccinni and Dr. Gutierrez.
La mia parola sarebbe cercare di scoprire il valore e il senso della interdipendenza. Penso che in relazione con la tecnologia abbiamo sviluppato un senso di autonomia troppo liberale o libertario, forse anche nella filosofia un po' degli Stati Uniti, e penso che nel rapporto con la tecnologia dobbiamo trovare la strada della interdipendenza. Questa pandemia ci ha scoperto in parte questo valore della interdipendenza, e penso che per capire bene un sviluppo tecnologico a misura umana non dobbiamo avere soltanto il valore dell'autonomia, ma anche il valore della interdipendenza.
I think that what is really important to discover is the value of interdependency, because so far we have developed a technology in a way that is perhaps a little bit too individualistic and liberal, whereas rediscovering the value of dependency on each other could perhaps inform a better development and understanding of technology, development of technology.
Grazie.
Thank you. There is one question that arrives from YouTube. Let's maybe just address that one. It says laws and public policies will always follow behind and come after new technological disruptions and paradigms since it grows and exponentially changes. Don't you think that these have already been a problem and it will be worse? I mean, the fact that regulations are always behind technological development. How can the legal framework catch up, basically? Maria Rosaria, do you want to take a peek at that one?
Yes. So I think that there is, I partially answered to these questions before, because I think that there is a principle that's very important that has been codified in many declarations by European Parliament, and this is sustainability. So every action must have a test to verify the possible consequences of a scientific act or technology. So the first question is, what is the impact of this technology on human being, on human well-being? There is a radically modification of the human person. What is the impact, the first impact? So legal framework, according to my opinion, must define, first of all, which are the bad consequences of technology on human being. And so it's not easy to do, because it's important the scientific support for this reason, because I don't think that it's easy to find a strictly norm that can forbid some kinds of action. For example, pollution could be avoided by individuating some kind of limits of some limits. That limits must be individuated by scientific community and then introited by law and by state law. But it's not easy. It's not easy to do.
Yes, indeed, it is connected to my previous question on how should we prevent altogether technology to be developed and prevent them by law, right? So in a certain sense, those two questions were connected.
I think that
certainly.
Sorry,
go ahead.
It's a moral question. If everyone feel this problem as a moral problem, and if every one of us act individuating its limit in a route that is not only legal but ethics, maybe law can respond better to this problem. But if we don't feel this problem as ethical and moral, it's difficult to respect law. I don't think if it's clear.
No, yes, absolutely. I would even add, as take my moderator privilege and add something in a sense that I think is very important also, education and spaces as this one that we are providing today, so that we can talk about these issues and inform as much people as possible also in our communities. Chiara, yes?
Sorry, I have a question, but I don't know if we are running out of time.
1 minute and go ahead.
1 minute, 1 minute. Okay, I can say both in English and Italian, but basically, okay, start from Italian and then quickly translate. Stavo pensando, avendo sentito le presentazioni e soprattutto essendo molto affascinata da questa idea che non conoscevo bene sul transumanesimo, se questa, diciamo, magari educazione al transumanesimo ci può anche far pensare a come trattiamo noi i più deboli adesso, cioè perché nel transumanesimo magari tra qualche anno i più deboli potremmo essere noi, perché non abbiamo, non diventiamo super uomini e questo mi fa pensare, caspita, se i più deboli potremmo essere noi, allora come possiamo trattare i più deboli adesso, quindi già da questo momento. So basically, if in English, if thinking about transhumanism, one day the weakness could be us, the weak ones, those that are not superhuman. So how can that make us think about how we treat now those that are weaker compared to us from many points of view, physical or not just physical, many aspects. So it's for everyone.
I think that we already have an important principle that is present in all declaration and constitution of every country of the world, that is equality principle. But the equality principle is an abstract and general norm, but its application is the very difficulty, because there are many inequalities generated by economical power, and so transhumanism has this problematic aspect, because using science to increase ability and so to give health to a part of people that is inevitably linked to economical power, it's not according to the equality principle. We have this human dignity principle, equality principle, but the answer, the response is an ethical response. We have this norm, but how can we apply this norm in our life? we can't do this without an ethic and moral basis. In my opinion, this is the only way. So to participate in civil association, participate as civil society, because to invert the processes. So starting by the bottom and not by the top of society, to produce these changes, this change. So social doctrine of church offers many opportunity to these changes. We think, for example, to Laudato Si and the problem of pollution, of common house of all people, human integral ecology. So this is we can start from this basis, that is a moral ethical basis, because law it's general and it's abstract, but can't be applied without a participation of people.
Thank you so much to all of you and to our attendees today. We will reconvene for our third webinar on this series of human rights and new frontiers of human rights on February 4th, 2022, under the new theme of human rights at international borders. Another very interesting and hot topic today. So I hope to see you all in February 4th. Stay tuned and thank you for joining us today.